Okay, what was now your name? Okay.
Jadis Blurton.
To deliver a talk, to teach how to teach the SEN students. So they will be video the talk, but they will not video our face. Don't worry, all right? Therefore, even though you see at the front, then only the back of your hair will be seen. Okay? So,
So are we talking for 1 hour or 2 hours today?
It's 1.5 hours.
1.5.
To what is
So right in the middle. Okay, so I'll speak sort of fast, not too fast, not too slow. That's perfect. Okay, my name is Jadis Blurton, and we run the Family Development Center, which deals with a lot of kids who have attentional disorders and learning disorders, and maybe kids who are on the autism spectrum. So we're going to be talking today about all three of those types of things that go on in classes. Any school, anywhere, is going to have some of those kids. There's no school that can sort of weed out all of those kids, even if they want to. So it's important for teachers to know how to deal with kids. And we're going to talk first about attentional control. So ADHD, as it's usually known, but very badly known because it's a very bad name. So let's see, how do I make this happen? Okay, ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? But all of that is wrong because it is not an attentional deficit. People who have ADHD can pay attention extremely well to the things that they find interesting or exciting or new or very motivating, but they have a hard time with things that are boring or repetitive or take a lot of effort or that they didn't choose themselves, okay? So there are a lot of CEOs out there who have ADHD because they can pay attention very, very well to the things that they think are interesting, but they have a hard time paying attention to all the little details. So they have secretaries who take care of all the little details while they pay attention to the bigger picture. So it's not a deficit of attention, it's a deficit of attentional control. It's almost as if those kids don't have an on switch and an off switch to turn on their attention. Okay? Perfect. And as we'll find out, we talk about ADHD, but the H stands for hyperactivity, and not all kids have hyperactivity who have ADHD. So the hyperactivity part is also not quite correct. Some people have ADHD with no hyperactivity. And oddly enough and confusingly enough, it's called ADHD, predominantly inattentive type. So it still has the H in its title, which doesn't make any sense. And I personally have a problem with the word disorder because I think a lot of people who have ADHD are not disordered so much as just a little different in some ways. They have some strengths that offset a lot of the things that normally people consider to be a disorder. And the other thing to remember is that it's a spectrum disorder. Everybody is on the spectrum somewhere. It's not like cancer. With cancer, you're either pregnant or you're not, or you either have cancer or you don't have cancer. Or pregnancy, you are either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You can't be just a little bit pregnant and you can't have just a little bit of cancer. But with ADHD, like with sadness, if you think about it, you can be a little bit sad, or you can be very, very sad, or you can be extremely sad, or you can be clinically depressed, right? And the same thing is true with ADHD. You can be, very, very organized, or a little disorganized, or very disorganized, or a complete flake. And so everybody is somewhere on the spectrum. It's not like a light switch. Sorry, why is this doing this? Up, how do I go back? Previous. Okay, so on that spectrum, we would have, if this is average people who have some problems with attention sometimes, or forget things sometimes, but not very often, my secretary would be way over on this side of the spectrum. She's very, very organized. She can shift her attention very easily. She never forgets things. And my son would be very far up here. He's the kid who was always forgetting things in class, lost things every day. I knew the fax number of HKIS by heart because he would always leave his homework on his desk. So those kids are way up there. And everybody is somewhere on the spectrum. We begin to define it as ADHD when it is interfering with normal functioning, okay? So a better name for it is a problem with executive functioning. And if you ever want to read a good guy to sort of learn a lot about ADHD, Tom Brown is one of my favorites. He's sort of a guru in the field. And he talks about problems of executive functioning. By the way, can anybody guess why we can't change the name? The DSM-5 just came out. And once again, we've named it ADHD, even though nobody likes that name. Any guesses as to why? Because they'd have to redo all the labels for pharmaceutical companies. And so it's purely a financial decision, has nothing to do with what people really think ADHD is. But it is a problem with executive functioning. And he's separated it into several different things that people have a hard time with. So, and people, it's a syndrome. So some people have some of these things, some people have all of these things, and some people have a few of these things. And we're looking at whether they have, kind of a lot of these things to be able to make a diagnosis. But people who have problems with executive functioning have problems organizing, prioritizing, and activating to task. In other words, starting something and deciding what comes first. Starting your homework, starting your taxes, stopping watching TV to start your homework or to start your taxes. All of those things would go under the organizing, prioritizing, and activating for tasks. And lots of times people with ADHD tend to think that two things may be equally important when a lot of other people would look at them and go, no, they're not equally important. This thing is clearly much more important than this thing over here. Focusing, sustaining, and shifting attention to tasks. We all know about the kids who in class are having a hard time paying attention to your voice or listening to the lecture, and they may be easily distracted. And so we talk about focus, but also being able to keep that focus over a long period of time and being able to shift your focus from one thing to another and then come back. A lot of times, a lot of people will be very focused on things for short periods of time, but if you interrupt them for even a moment, it's very hard for them to get back into what they're doing. I'm that way, and my secretary knows that unless the building is on fire, she is not allowed to come and interrupt me when I'm working on something on the computer, because as soon as she interrupts me, it's going to be another hour and a half before I get back to whatever I was working on the computer. So being able to shift your attention and bring it back is difficult. Being able to regulate alertness and sustain effort and maintain processing speed. These are the kids who will take a long, long time to finish something, partly because they're just drifting off. They're not operating at normal speed. And lots of times they'll fall asleep in class. Managing frustration and modulating emotion. People who have problems with executive functioning, and I think it's because they don't like bumping into that door. They're already anticipating, because they are thinking fast, they're already anticipating what comes next. And when you slam the door on them, they get very upset very quickly. There is a difference between state anger and trait anger. Trait anger is the type of anger that people talk about a lot when they talk about an angry child, when they talk about a child who maybe was abused when he was very little or has a divorce going on at home. This kid's carrying around a lot of anger, and he may be very easy to set off. So what would you do with that child? With that child, you would be talking about therapy, talking about dealing with whatever issues he's dealing with, giving him coping skills and so on, to bring down that level of anger that he's carrying around with him, right? But trait anger is that episodic, very quick state anger, is that episodic, very quick anger where you explode You have a problem with anger control, you explode very quickly, and then 5 minutes later you're fine. So you don't really actually have an underlying anger at the world, you weren't abused. Any amount of therapy is not going to help you because you really don't have any major issue. You just have a problem with anger control. So as soon as you get angry, you explode, and then 10 minutes later you're fine. Those kids quite often are having problems managing frustration and modulating their emotion, right? Using working memory and accessing recall. Working memory is very closely tied to attention. Working memory is how many things you can keep in your mind at the same time and still do something with it. So if I ask you to add 596 plus 387, you're going to go 6 plus 7 is 30. You forgot what those numbers were as you tried to, right? That's working memory because you're trying to do something at the same time as you're trying to hold things in your memory. And if you think about it, most people can keep about 7 or 8 things in their mind at the same time. Most people adults have a working memory of about 7 or 8 things, which is why a telephone number is about 7 or 8 numbers long. But if you're trying to hold a telephone number in your mind and somebody interrupts you, you'll very quickly turn your attention to the other person, and then you'll come back and go, oh, I can't remember what it was, right? And the reason you can't remember what it was is because your working memory was tied to your attention. As soon as you shift your attention, everything goes out of your working memory. So people who have problems controlling their attention have problems with working memory. Quite often we either see it as a weakness for that particular child, or we see it as a bouncy working memory. So sometimes when they're able to concentrate, they have a really good working memory and can keep lots of stuff in their mind, and then other times when they're not able to concentrate, their working memory is very poor. So either it's a consistent weakness or bouncy. And being able to monitor and self-regulate action, that's being able to not knock over the computer next to you and not kick the kid next to you and not lean back in your chair and not jump up and down. And remember not to fall backwards when you're in line and knock over the 6 kids behind you. That's self-regulation. That's being able to say to yourself, maybe I shouldn't do that. Mr. Chan's going to be mad at me if I do that. You know, I need to think twice before I do that. With ADHD, lots of times it's, ready, shoot, aim, not ready, aim, shoot. The thought about what they're supposed to do comes after actually having done it. So what do we see? We see variability of performance, which is very confusing to adults and to kids. We see kids who are performing extremely well in one area, or in one type of classroom, or with one teacher, or at one time of day, and then not at all with another teacher or at other times of day. And it's very confusing for the kids because what the adults say to them is, I know you can do this, you did it yesterday. Or, I know you can do this, you pay lots of attention in music class, why don't you pay attention in math? So we see that variability of performance, and part of it is because of the environment, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and part of it might be the teacher is more motivating or more scary, or part of it may be that the interest is higher and they feel more self-directed in some classes. So variability of performance. The ability to hyperfocus. People who have ADHD can hyperfocus. You can almost see them go into their zoom zone. They can pay attention extremely well to the things that are interesting to them, or things that are motivating and exciting to them, or things that they've chosen. You can see them as they're doing computer games tune out everything else. So you can be standing beside them with a brass band and they're not noticing you because they're so focused on what they're doing. Or they'll be so focused on something that if you try to interrupt them, they may be able to shift their attention, but it's very emotionally wrenching. So as they move to you, they're really upset because you are bothering them because they're hyper-focusing on what they're doing. And this is why a lot of CEOs you can look and see the ADHD traits, and one of them is this ability to totally get in a zone. So the ability to hyper-focus. You see time distortion. People who have attentional disorders tend to pay attention to the present. They don't pay attention to last week, or God forbid last year, or a month from now, or 2 weeks from now. So if you say that if you don't do your homework today, then at the end of the term you're going to get a bad grade. Nobody cares. I had a kid one time come into me for therapy, and he was getting detention every time he did something bad. And they kept adding more detentions on. So the detention was once a week, and I was seeing the kid in October. I said, well, okay, they keep adding them on. When do your detentions run out? And he said, oh, I think sometime in May. So he had months of detention built up, and any teacher that looked at him and said, you've got another detention, what did he care? You know, the world might explode by then. You know, he might win the lottery by then. Anything could happen before May. He doesn't care. He's not connected. So unless whatever is happening right now, kids with ADHD and adults with ADHD, they may have a cognitive understanding that it might be important, but emotionally they're not connected to things that are far in the distant future or far in the distant past. Boredom management. I can lean back in my chair if I'm bored. I can be the class clown. I can kick the kid next to me. I can pick a fight. I can argue with the teacher. I can do a lot of stuff if I'm really, really bored to try to get unbored, right? A lot of times you see that emotional discontrol. You see kids who are flying off the handle for very little reason because they're frustrated at something very small or that seems very small to us, because they're just not able to control that emotion. I had an adult man that I knew who had ADHD who came in one time, and he had a beanbag chair that was filled with little beads, and he sat down on the beanbag chair. The beanbag chair broke, and he ended up throwing a temper tantrum where he threw things all over his house because this beanbag chair had broken. It was very frustrating for him. No executive. Tom Brown says this is as if you have an orchestra, and the orchestra has a great string section. It has a good woodwind section. The pianist is fabulous. You know, you've got good percussion over here. And the conductor's an alcoholic. So sometimes the conductor comes out and the conductor is great and everybody plays at the right time and everything works perfectly and everybody says, what a great orchestra. And then sometimes the conductor comes out and nobody knows when to start and he's doing a really terrible job of making sure that everybody goes at the right time, okay? So not having that executive or having an executive that you can't count on all the time can be very disruptive to the whole system. A lot of people sort of put this down. They think, well, okay, now there's a neurologically based responsibility disorder, so we're really just letting people off for being bad or for being irresponsible. You know, how silly is that? They're getting rewarded for being irresponsible. It's very convenient for them, but it's not so convenient. It ends up with them having a sense of failure, a feeling that they have not done well in life or done as well in life as they could have done. There's a book called You Mean I'm Not Lazy, Crazy, or Stupid? And you know, I love that title. I think it's a great title because it just encapsulates the way people with ADHD tend to think about themselves. And adults with ADHD tend to come to me not because they have ADHD, but because they feel like they're stupid or they're lazy or they're a flake and their self-esteem is low or they're depressed and anxious. So there's a sense of failure. Kids with ADHD tend to always get in trouble. You know, they expect the day to go where they show up, get in trouble for either having done something or not having done something, having forgotten something or doing something to the kid next to them. No, I'm going backwards again. Having relationships becomes very difficult. It's difficult for adults with ADHD and it's difficult for kids with ADHD because not only might they forget things, but other people get tired of reminding them. Other people, spouses, friends, girlfriends, get tired of them not listening There's the sense that they're not listening to what you're talking about, or they'll interrupt in the middle of what you're saying and be talking about something completely different, so they can appear very rude. So being able to sustain relationships is hard. Tend to be impulsive, self-destructive lots of times, especially if their self-esteem is low. And if you don't have good regulation of your actions and you have low self-esteem and you're always getting in trouble, it's pretty much a ticket for having bigger problems. Being unable to complete tasks. Lots of times people with ADHD will have many, many unfinished tasks. Edison is a great example. He used to have about 60 things that he was working on at any one time, and he would just kind of wander around from thing to thing because completing it was a lot harder than starting it. A lot of them, about 50 to 70% of untreated adults end up with alcohol or drug problems, so that's not very convenient. And a lot of them have other comorbid conditions, other conditions that go along with it, like anxiety, depression, and so on. So that's pretty incredible. 4 or more other conditions by the time they're adults if they don't have their ADHD addressed, or if they're living and working as a child in sort of an unfriendly environment. So that's a huge amount. So the answer is no, it's really not very convenient at all. And it's even worse if you have kids with high IQ. And there are a lot of kids with ADHD who have very high IQ. So what happens? What happens is before they go to school, everybody says, oh, you're so smart, you know everything, you're gonna do so well at school, you're gonna love school, school's gonna be great. You and school are a great fit. So they march off to school, 4 years old, 5 years old, and they think they're gonna be great because they've been told that they're really smart kids. They know that they're really smart kids. They learn things quickly. They like talking to adults. So far, life has been great for them. And so they've internalized all of these high expectations. They march off to school with all of these good hopes, which are, of course, very quickly dashed because they get in trouble. Kids who are in lower primary school, very often, if they're very smart, if they're very intelligent kids, they get by pretty well because a lot of lower primary is oral, verbal. I may ask you a question, but there isn't a whole lot of long-term planning or long-term work or long-term homework. So kids with attentional problems, when they're little, they may not be paying attention, but it's okay because they can get by because they can answer the question anyway. And the best example of this is my own son, Daniel, the one I had remember where he was on the chart? When he was little, I picked him up from school once when he was about 7 years old. And I said, how was your day? And he said, not so good. And I said, oh, that's too bad. What happened? And he said, well, you know that voice your teacher gets when she's about to ask a question and you have to listen so you can know the answer and you can answer a question? And I said, yeah, because I know that voice actually from my own childhood. Yeah, I know that voice. And he said, well, today she had that voice and I didn't hear her, so I didn't know the answer to the question. And I said, oh, okay, that's too bad. And then I thought about it for a second and I said, Daniel, what do you do the rest of the time? When she doesn't have that voice, when she's not talking in that voice, what do you do the rest of the time? And he said, oh, I think about stuff. So that's what he was doing all day long, as he was sitting and thinking about stuff. He was very bright, so he knew that if he only heard the question, chances were pretty good that he already knew the answer. So there are a couple of things there. The first is that most of his day was spent daydreaming. The second thing was that we were actually teaching him to daydream, because why would he want to sit through something he already knew? We were actually reinforcing that for him. He already had an attentional problem, but we made it worse by sort of teaching him not to pay attention when he was in lower primary. So the impairment is masked because they're getting A's in school, they're getting good grades because they're answering all the questions. And that means that lots of times they don't run into problems until upper primary or middle school when all of a sudden the tasks change and they're being required to do things that take more planning and a lot more effort and maybe have many parts. So they're asking to organize. So a lot of times they don't get in trouble. And what happens with our international school kids is that lots of times they'll move. They move very often. So lots of times you'll have older kids, upper primary or middle school, they've just moved. They're in a new place. So we're not going to pay attention because, probably it's just they're fitting into the new place. Then they're 11, 12 years old, and they're just getting into all the teenage stuff. So they're a little boy crazy. They don't really have a problem. They're just boy crazy, or they've just suddenly entered adolescence and now all they care about is their friends. So the actual fact that they might have, or possibility that they might have an attentional problem, lots of times we don't notice it because they're so bright. And they can talk their way out of it. So what happens is that then the teachers who know that they're very bright, the parents who know that they're very bright, give them a hard time because we know you're very bright. We know you can do this work. We know you can pay attention because yesterday you were paying attention in music class. But eventually the teachers and the parents don't want to be too mean. They don't want to seem like they're ogres. They want to be understanding. They don't want to be beating this kid up. So they put him in the easier class. Kid's not doing his math homework, so we're gonna put him in the easy math class, right? This is a high IQ kid. And people who have ADHD, remember what they don't like? They don't like anything that is boring or repetitive. So actually, in trying to solve the problem, you've made the problem worse. Because if you put them in an easier class, they're just more bored and it's more repetitive for them. But we reduce the challenges for them because we're trying to be nice. And eventually, when you go over long periods of time, the ability is just gone. Another good example of the fact that this doesn't work is my son was in high school, and he called me up on the phone. He was in boarding school. He called me up on the phone. He said, I don't understand it. I'm taking a harder course this year. He was taking 5 AP classes all at once. And he said, this is a harder course than I've ever taken in my whole life, and all of a sudden I'm doing much better than I ever was before. And I had to laugh because he was always like that. He always did better if you made it harder and did not do as well if you made it easy, because if you made it easy, it was more boring for him. So again, people with high IQ ADHD, it's as if they have a great string section or a virtuoso pianist, but no conductor for the orchestra. Right? And we also have kids who don't have the hyperactive type. And lots of times these are girls. And lots of times these people are not noticed in class. They don't get referred. They don't get referred because they're not making trouble. They're not falling off the chair. They're not poking the kid next to them. They're not impulsive. They're not too active in the hallway. So the teachers are just sort of not paying attention to the kid who's not paying attention. And I had a friend who once described this as sort of like being a butterfly on drugs, la-di-da-di-da, we're out the window. My son, when he was not paying attention in class, he wasn't making any trouble, so the teacher would never have referred him because he was just not paying attention. So what you guys need to do is just note when you have a kid who seems to be not paying attention, who seems to be disorganized, who seems to be forgetting things or losing things. Those are all the inattentive symptoms that may not necessarily also have falling off the chair. Lots of times these are girls, and we call them flaky or boy crazy or dumb blondes or whatever. There are lots of different ways to look at girls who are not paying attention. None of them are fair to the girls who are not being diagnosed. They're not being lazy. People with attentional problems are not being lazy. But they tend to procrastinate, put things off. Again, that has to do with sort of ordering and prioritizing things. Tend to be disorganized, often forgetful, distractible, but very quiet, sitting in the back of the room maybe, or very social, maybe sitting in the back of the room and talking to their friend. So let's think about this. Actually, it's very funny that just this morning, I had this come up. This would be ridiculous. If Rodney is blind, we're not going to give him this report card. We're not going to say, Rodney's having difficulty seeing as well as would be expected for his age. We would like to see him see better, and he needs to put more effort into seeing in all areas of the curriculum. This semester, Rodney has been blinder than most children his age, and we hope he will work on this in the future. We don't send that to parents of a child who can't see, right? And we don't say to the kid, you're not seeing. Everybody else in this room can see perfectly well. Why are you tripping over the chairs all the time? Why can't you find the door? Everybody else found the door. You need to be fine. I want you to come in tomorrow and you show me you can find the door. I want you to see better tomorrow. So we don't say that to blind kids. It's just as ridiculous. We don't have any problem saying that for kids with ADHD. So what do you do with a blind kid? If you have a blind kid, you don't say, oh, that's all right. We're just going to let him trip over the chairs. We're just going to let him fall down the stairs. We're just going to let him bump into the walls. We're going to let him not learn to read because after all, he's blind. He can't see. Do we just say, we're not going to pay any attention to it? We're going to let him off with not doing anything in life because he can't see? No. We say, okay, what is it he can't do? Well, he can't find the wall, or he falls down the stairs, or he trips over the chairs. Those are specific things that he can't do. So you identify the specific problems. Then you say, okay, how are we going to deal with those problems? Maybe to help him find the walls, we'll give him a cane. Maybe he can have a buddy while he's going down the stairs. Maybe we'll teach him Braille instead of asking that he read regular text. There are lots of strategies that we can use with a blind kid that will be better than just saying, oh, well, he's blind, he can't do anything. So we want to teach them that being blind is a hurdle, not an excuse. And the same thing is true with ADHD. You teach them that ADHD is a hurdle, not an excuse. You still have to pay your taxes. You still have to do your college entrance essays. You still have to do your homework. There's a lot of stuff you still have to do in life. And it might be a little harder if you have trouble controlling your attention, but it's so much easier because you're really good at math, or you're really good at writing, or whatever it is you're really good at. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, and what you want to say to the ADHD kid is, well, your particular weakness tends to be organization. And you're going to identify the specific problem. You're having problems getting your homework in, maybe. And you're going to choose a strategy to deal with the problem. You're going to evaluate that strategy and replace or retain the strategy. And you're going to teach the kid to do that process as well, so that when the kid gets to university, the kid is going to be able to identify the problem, choose a strategy to deal with the problem, evaluate the strategy, and replace or retain the strategy when he gets to college. Now, I said this just this morning. I had another parent who said on the child's IEP, it said he will learn to focus in all areas of the curriculum. Don't write that. No, first of all, no, he won't. It's probable that if he has a problem with ADHD, he probably won't learn to focus in all areas of the curriculum. But in the second place, there's no way he can control that. It's a very vague thing to say. I'm not sure I even understand what it means. And there's no strategy for making it happen. It's just like saying he's going to learn to see better. No, he's not going to learn to see better. So if you are making up an IEP for a kid who has an attentional problem, put down strategies, or he will learn 10 strategies for focusing better in the classroom, but not just he's going to focus better or he's going to try harder, because those things are not going to happen. It doesn't make sense to say try harder. It doesn't make sense to say more effort is needed, because guess what? ADHD, the whole executive functioning group of things, is basically characterized by not being able to control your effort. So you can't tell people to control their effort if they have a diagnosed disorder that says they can't control their effort. So it does make sense to say try using different strategies, because whatever strategies you're using right now, that's not working. That didn't get your homework in. So you need to try something different. Try doing your homework in a different room, in a different way. Try working with a homework coach, or staying for a homework club after school, or any number of different things that you can come up with to try to use different strategies. It does make sense to say the strategies you're using right now are not working. And kids get that. So as teachers, here's some general solutions. This is a performance-based deficit. It is not that they don't understand what it is they are supposed to do. So yelling at them about why they need to do their homework, why they need to get good grades, how important college is, how they're never going to get a job if they don't get A's in this class, all of those things, they could give that lecture themselves. They don't need you to tell them those things. They know those things. They're not stupid. So they have already internalized all those things. They know those things. What they have a problem with is output, not input. They have a problem with producing whatever it is that they're supposed to do, not with understanding what it is they're supposed to do. They do understand. They know how to do things. And you need to educate the kids to control their own strategies, control their own output. Some of that in the lower grades, of course, is going to come primarily from the guidance of the parents and teachers. But by the time they get to be about upper primary, middle primary, we want them contributing to this and maybe testing whether a strategy worked. Kids with the ADHD have a hard time, and adults have a hard time with transitions, and sometimes they have problems, little kids have problems getting into the bathtub or out of the bathtub, or getting themselves to bed, or getting themselves away from the computer, or getting them, if they're adults, getting themselves to work or from work, all of those things. So I had a kid one time who was really quite young, about 7 years old. And we made a chart with, happy faces, sad faces, and neutral faces. And the child was able to evaluate whether the particular strategy we were trying about getting into the bathtub was working very well. So even young kids can evaluate strategies. Allow failure. This is why pencils have erasers. You can't succeed unless you fail first. You can't know what it is you're supposed to do unless you've messed it up somehow. So allow failure. If you're trying a new strategy, it's quite possible that strategy won't work. Not all strategies work with all people. So you have to allow them to fail and then say, well, that didn't work. What else could we try? And if they say, I could try harder, you say, that's not going to work. Don't try harder. Try different. Remember that people with ADHD tend to have a time window that is distorted. They tend to not focus on things that are events that are far away. So if you threaten a punishment, if you say, Daddy's going to be so mad when he gets home 6 hours from now, the 2-year-old or the 3-year-old doesn't care. That, by the way, is not because they have ADHD. It's because 2- and 3-year-olds don't have an executive functioning in the first place. So it's not a very useful strategy. And the same thing is true with teachers. If you say you're going to have detention 2 weeks from now, or you're going to be in trouble next week, or I'm going to call your parents later on at the end of the semester, that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work for the kid, and it certainly doesn't work for the parents either. I got an email one time from an international school that shall be nameless in town, and it said, your son Daniel owes 72 math assignments by Monday. What could I do with that? There's nothing I could do with that. Because obviously he wasn't going to do 72 math assignments by Monday. And why didn't you tell me when he missed the first one? Because I could have gotten him then. For the last 20 years or so, and I really do think it's irresponsible on the part of the teachers or the teaching profession. Teachers have started to think, or educators, we have all started to think, we're going to give responsibility to kids. We're going to teach kids to be responsible by ignoring when they're not. And that doesn't work. The only way to teach kids to be responsible is to notice when they're not responsible. So the example I always give is that when I was a kid, I never had problems. I had a lot of attentional problems, but I never had problems getting homework in or very rarely, because I knew I walked to school and I walked home from school, and I had to turn a corner. At the end of the corner was my house. And if I hadn't done my homework, I knew I was going to turn that corner, and at the end of the street was going to be my doorway, and my mother was going to be standing in the doorway like this. You know, my mother was going to know right away, because the teacher would have called her and said she didn't get her homework in, and my mom would have been mad. So I knew that there was an immediate reinforcement or loss if I didn't do my homework. Whatever it is that you are doing has to be right away, has to be something that feels important. It couldn't be points or stickers. It doesn't have to be, you know, something enormously important, but it has to add up, and it has to be right now, not next week or later. And parents need to know about things right away. Actually, parents need to know about things before they happen, rather than later on. So they need to be meaningful. Similarly, a lot of people say, or for a long time, psychologists were saying, just ignore bad behavior and reward good behavior, and everything's going to be great, you know, because, you know, that will, people will notice that Jane over here, Johnny will notice that Jane is getting rewarded for being such a good little girl, and so you want to pay attention to that and just ignore Johnny. And sometimes that works. But a lot of times with kids with ADHD, they don't even notice that you just rewarded Jane, because they're not paying attention. So what you want to do instead with Johnny, don't be yelling at him, don't be punishing him, just ask him if he can hand out the papers, you know, or ask him if he can run an errand for you, or ask him to come up and talk about something. Interrupt the behavior that you're not liking, until it gets to be something overwhelming. But don't ignore it, because if you ignore it, lots of times people with ADHD are not going to be paying attention to what it is you're doing. By that same token, schedule need meeting activities. If you know that you've got a kid who's very active in your class, send them to do things. Let them stand up behind the desk, because there's no problem with standing up in class. And in fact, I just met with a furniture dealer yesterday, and I can tell you that these chairs are absolutely unhealthy for kids. You know, we put kids in these chairs all day long. We know that adults are now moving to standing up desks, and it's more healthy for all of us to stand up sometimes and to not be sitting down all day long. And for kids to be sitting down all day long is unhealthy for them. And of course, what they do is they then squirm around and want to move, and their body is telling them that this is not a healthy thing to do. It's not a good place to be. But for kids who have attentional problems, especially if they have a lot of hyperactivity, they're very active kids, they really need to be up and around. And that can change everything. My sister was a mentor teacher of the gifted in a school in Virginia. And there was one kid, you know the kid that everybody dreads getting, you know, and everybody talks about from the time he's in second grade. Teachers' lounge are always talking about, oh God, what did this kid do today? So this kid's name was Ev. And my sister was teaching sixth grade, so she got second, third, fourth, fifth, 4 years of warning about Ev, who was coming to her class. So 4 years later, she goes in and Ev is in her class, and it's really, she's dreading the day because she knows it's going to be a really hard year. And Ev is perfect. She thought Ev has really good eye contact. He responds really well when she asks a question. He's the one that always, raises his hand and has the answer. And, now my sister, mind you, is a little strange herself, but she really didn't have any problem with this kid at all. And she was completely confused by why. And about 2 weeks later, a little girl came up and said, where should I put this flower pot? And my sister said, I'm really not sure. And she said, should I put it on Ev's perch? My sister said, Ev's perch? What do you mean on Ev's perch? And she said, well, where Ev always sits, on top of the coat closet. And my sister looked over and realized that Ev, for the last 2 weeks, had been sitting on the coat closet, which was about this high, and that had allowed him to dangle his feet, and he had been right at her eye level, which is why she thought he had such good eye contact, and he hadn't been squirmy at all because his body had been comfortable. So lots of times now I'm not suggesting that you always have your ADHD kids sit on the coat closet, but changing the way their physical demands can sometimes make a big difference, and allowing kids who have a lot of activity to move is very important. Providing a standing desk option is good. Never, ever, ever argue with an angry child. Never argue with an angry anybody, actually, because it's kind of a useless thing to do. Nobody who is angry, when two people are angry and they're having an argument, nobody ever stops and says, oh, you're right. Don't argue with an angry spouse. Don't argue with an angry boyfriend, but don't argue with an angry child because the child is not listening. The child who is angry is rehearsing his own argument. So as you're talking to him, he's not listening to your great words of wisdom. He's rehearsing whatever it is he's going to say back to you. So, and this is true also of your spouse, by the way. So never argue with an angry child. Wait, let them calm down someplace else and then talk to them later about whatever it is that you think they need to think about. So here's some specific strategy examples. The easiest and best one is a fiddle toy. So this is not a good fiddle toy. You know why this is not a good fiddle toy? It's not a good fiddle toy because it makes a lot of noise, and that disturbs other people. So that's not good. The other thing that's not good about this fiddle toy is for kids who are very active, it becomes a target and something that can, be shot at people. That's not great. A fiddle toy should be something you can keep in your hand, and maybe a clip. I like the type of clip that can open and shut, like for big pieces of paper. So a clip, blue tack. A lot of people use blue tack. Some people don't like blue tack because it ends up getting washed in the washing machine. But blue tack is good. A worry stone sometimes is good. A little ball, a squeezy ball is good. Now the reason you need a fiddle toy is because what that fiddle toy does is it takes away a little bit of your floating attention. So that part of your attention that is thinking about how you might buy a cat or move to Mongolia, or what would be wrong with moving to Malta. Malta would be good. That would be a good place to move. That part of your brain that just got taken away, if you have a fiddle toy, that's less likely to happen. Okay, so it actually, a lot of times teachers get upset with kids because they're fiddling, but actually fiddling is helping them to concentrate rather than keeping them from concentrating. If you have high school kids quite often taking notes, it takes the place of that fiddle toy. It helps them to concentrate. So you need something that's a sensory distractor. For little kids, again, it can become a target or something that they can throw across the room or, become too distracting. So having something that is a sensory distractor that is attached to their desk, just like an emery board or something that they can feel, I had a kid one time who poked holes in his legs because he just needed something to feel that was going to keep him paying attention to the teacher. That's not great. You know, let's have something that's a little more, something that they can fiddle with, that can hang from the desk or that is on the desk, that can help them to take that floating attention away. One of the most brilliant ADHD strategies that I've ever seen, you have kids who don't do their homework. Now, remembering what I said a little while ago about sort of the effort over the last 20 years, 2 decades or so, has been to let kids be responsible for their own homework. You know, a good goal, but not necessarily achievable by ignoring when they don't get the homework in. On the other hand, you don't want to be calling up the parents every 2 minutes. So one of the best strategies I ever saw, this was in my son's class in 7th grade. He had a lot of problems getting homework in. And we'll talk about why in a second. There are lots of different parts of doing homework. But when he was in 7th grade, if the teacher had, not for him, but for all kids, a big chart on the wall. And the chart had every single kid's name. And she would collect the homework in little groups. So she would go to this table and she would have a packet of yellow Post-it notes. And so if you didn't have your homework, you would just say, I'm sorry, I don't have it. And I would write down, okay, so-and-so doesn't have her homework. It's page 33, numbers 1 to 9. Okay? And then I would take the homework from the next kid, and the next kid, and the next kid. And some of these kids are going to have Post-it notes. So I go over to my chart and I put the Post-it note up on the chart. That's not to shame the child or to make them feel bad, it's to remind them, because what happens in most classes is the teacher just marks a 0, closes the book, puts it in her desk, and the kid doesn't even remember that he didn't do the homework, right? So that's when mom gets an email saying so-and-so owes 72 math assignments, right? So this Post-it note would go up, and that was just to remind the child that that homework needed to be done. Well, tomorrow, or the next day or the next week, she comes in again, and you again don't have your homework. Once again, I mark it down, and I come over and I put it up on the chart. Now she's got 2 Post-it notes. Can anybody guess what the next step would be? What happens when you get 2 Post-it notes? Get 2 Post-it notes, you have to schedule an appointment with the teacher. You have to sit down with the teacher and talk about how you're going to get these 2 pieces of homework in, right? So it's still just between us, but you need to come see me because we got to talk about when you're going to do these 2 assignments that are up there. And next week, I come back, and once again, she hasn't got her homework done. See, aren't you sorry you sat there? So once again, doesn't have her homework done. Now I've got 3 Post-it notes. Anybody guess what it is that happens after you get 3 Post-it notes? You have a meeting with the teacher and mom and dad. So nobody wants to get to 3 Post-it notes because mom and dad are going to get called. So I still get phone calls on the from teachers all over the place who say, when they're trying to describe a kid, they'll say, you know, Jadis, he's one of those 2 Post-it notes kind of kids. And what that means is he's always on the edge of just getting in trouble. You know, he's sort of pushing it to as far as he can push, but he's not going to go to that 3rd thing, because that 3rd thing means that mom and dad are going to get engaged. So he's actually only going to ever be behind 2 homeworks. And eventually, after some period of time, remember with 2 homeworks, you still have to come see the teacher. And so the teacher's meeting with him, trying to get him those 2 homeworks done. So it was brilliant. And my son, by the way, instantly started getting all his homework done with his 2 Post-it notes up there. But once you've got 2 Post-it notes up there, you really have to do all your homework, because otherwise mom and dad will be called. So having that, it requires a little bit more organization at the outset, as I'm collecting all the homework, because I can't say everybody pass their homework to the front of the room. I actually have to individually collect, but after that, it's a much better system for keeping track, for the kids to be able to keep track. For younger kids, what is the age group here? Is it
12 to 18.
12 to 18, okay. So for younger kids, a sand timer for a specific task, say, see if you can finish 5 math problems by the time the sand runs out. For older kids, they can use a regular timer on an iPhone or something like that can allow them to try to race themselves to try to complete the task before it's finished or before the time runs out. When they're doing work, when they're doing homework, when they're doing work in class, separating things into small chunks is an extremely effective first step. So allowing them to do a little bit at a time and asking them to do this portion, then this portion, then this portion. Now, it's not periods of time, not chunks of time. So you don't say sit down and work for 5 minutes and then you can take a break and then work for 5 minutes and take a break. Because if I have to sit down and work for 5 minutes, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to think about whether I should get a cat. Moving to Malta is sounding even better. And, they have a good healthcare system in Malta. 5 minutes later, how much math have I got done? Nothing, right? So that doesn't work very well. Having small chunks of time does not work. But if I sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do 5 math problems, or I'm going to do 3 math problems, and then I'm going to go take a sip of Christie's water, and then I'll come back and do 3 more math problems, then that's a little piece of work, little break, little piece of work, little break. And what we say with older kids lots of times is come up and show what you've got to your teacher, or find some other quick break. This one actually was taught to me by my son, who was 6 at the time, and he was sitting at the table, and he was doing homework, and it was easy homework. It was 0 plus 0, and 1 plus 1, and 2 plus 1. I knew he knew how to do it. It was 20 problems. He could have done that in his sleep. It was easy stuff, but he couldn't do it. It was too hard. And he was, breaking his pencil and, ended up under the table, and he had to take a snack, and, then he had to go to the bathroom, and 90 minutes go by. I'm standing up behind him, ready to kill him because he's not getting this stuff done. And finally I said, okay, fine, you can't do 10 problems, or 20 problems. Can you do 10? And he said, no, I can't do 10, it's too hard, I can't do 10. I said, fine, can you do 5? He said, no, I can't do 5. I said, can you do 2? He said, yeah, I can do 2. I said, quick, do 2. So he did 2. I said, quick, run around the table. He ran around the table. I said, quick, do 2 more. He did 2 more. I said, quick, run around the table. He ran around the table. I said, quick, do 2 more. He did 2 more. I said, quick, run around the table. He ran around the table. Did that 10 times. He was done. It took 3 minutes. And he sat there at the table, kind of looking at it and going, oh. And I stood there behind him going, holy Toledo, that worked. It's done. So little pieces of work. And again, breaking it into small pieces. I had a graduate student one time who would finish reading a chapter in her library carrel. She had a library carrel so that she could work by herself. She would read one chapter, and then she would walk up and down the stacks, just one stack in the library, and then she would come back and do the next chapter. So even more complex tasks. Writing an essay, you can make the outline first, then take a 5-minute break, come back and do the introduction, take a 5-minute break, come back and do the body, or decide what resources you're going to use, or whatever. Even at the high school level, you can learn how to break things into smaller pieces and chunk tasks. With a big, huge project, as teachers, you can ask for the part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, rather than assigning the whole thing at once. When my son was in 7th grade, maybe 8th grade, 8th grade because it was a different math teacher, the math teacher decided at his school that people were cheating. People were copying math, and so her solution to this was that she was going to make sure that everybody turned in their math before school. So you were supposed to go to her class, turn in your math, and then go back to your homeroom, and then later on when you were in math class, that was fine. So my son, who has attentional problems, so it was difficult for him to remember to write down what he was supposed to do in the first place. Then put his journal into his backpack. Then remember the materials that he needed, like the textbook, to put into the backpack. There were lots of times when he was little, when he got home and he knew what he was supposed to do, but he didn't have the textbook to do it. Or we drove back to the school to get it. So having that in the backpack, having all the necessary materials, actually taking those things out, prioritizing the task so that he could take it out and start his homework, finishing his homework, sustaining his attention long enough to finish the homework, then getting his homework back into the backpack, right? Each one of these was a little challenge for him that maybe it wouldn't have been a little challenge for somebody else. It was something that he had learned. So he was actually really, really good at doing all of these things. And he liked math. He was good at math. But he'd learned all of those things, and suddenly he would get all of that homework done. He would put it back in his backpack, and he would get to school. He would run into all his friends. He would go off and play. And 2 hours later, when he got to math class, he would say, and his teacher would say, too late, 0. So he was doing all this homework, took him a couple hours, and he was still getting zeros. And it was getting to the point where he was saying, what's the point? Why should I even do the homework? I'm just going to get a 0 on it. Doesn't make sense. Now, remember, it's not an input problem, it's an output problem. He knew he was supposed to turn it in. It wasn't that he was being a little jerk. He wasn't a bad kid. He didn't need punishing because he had spent 2 hours doing that homework. He really did want to turn it in. There was nothing, he wasn't being passive aggressive or trying to upset anyone. So giving him punishments or having him sign a contract or any number of other sort of management tools for that wouldn't have worked. And I said to Danny, you need a strategy. What are you going to do? Now, Danny is a little sassy, so he looked at me and he said, try harder? And I said, no, that one won't work. And he said, okay, what if I asked my homeroom teacher if he would just tell me, you know, when I sit down, if he would just remind me. And I happen to know that the classroom teacher had ADHD, so I said that would probably work. You can just ask him if he'll do that for you. And so he told the teacher, and he said, all I really need for you to do is say Danny Math. 2 words. I just need you to say Danny Math. And if you say Danny Math, if I already turned it in, I'll just say I already turned it in, and if not, I'll go and turn it in. So the teacher said, sure, I can do that, Dan, no problem. He sat down every single morning, and the teacher looked at him and said, Danny Math, and Danny would either say, got it, I'm okay, or I forgot, and run and turn it in. 3 weeks later, it takes about 3 weeks for a habit to be formed. So by 3 weeks later, he was already getting so that most of the time he'd already turned it in. That was really, once that habit had been established. But in the meantime, he hadn't failed math, he hadn't learned to hate math, and he hadn't gotten in trouble and been expelled for not doing his homework. So there was a very productive and pretty easy 2 words, really not that hard. And we're not enabling the kid, we're helping the kid to learn that strategies help. Now as an adult, he has 18 million little electronic ways of reminding himself that he's supposed to go turn something in. So, and in fact, he just yesterday taught me how to use Boomerang on Gmail. So he's got ways of reminding himself, even on Gmail, to do things. But this was the beginning of that, and all he needed was somebody to help him figure out that strategy, rather than failing math. Having extra materials at home, online, textbooks, online homework assignments. As teachers, you need to make sure that whatever the homework assignments are online for parents to see. Because if they're not, the kid is not going to remember. A child with ADHD is not going to remember or is going to forget to write it down. And then parents get very frustrated because they can't help and they don't know what it is that they're supposed to do with their kid. there's only so much punishing after the fact that you can do, and it's not very productive. If you know that a big essay or a big project is due on Friday, and you're the parent, you can sit down and say, okay, you've got this big thing due on Friday, how can we break it up into pieces so you do a little bit every day, and show me when it's done, and then you can go out with your girlfriend on Friday. That's great. If you find out Friday afternoon that it was due today and Johnny didn't do it, then Johnny's in trouble, you're having a fight with your husband, your husband's angry at your kid, all kinds of things are happening, maybe intended, maybe unintended, but the point is nobody taught Johnny how to get his homework done, right? Which was really the point. So having extra materials like textbooks, people forget that textbooks a lot, kids do. Now, optimally, you're not using a whole lot of textbooks. You may have a lot of other materials that are online or that are accessible. It's becoming less and less of a problem. But if you do have textbooks, just get an extra textbook for the kid to have at home, because that way he doesn't have to remember to bring it back and forth. Highlighting. Kids with ADHD lots of times can read perfectly well, but they don't remember what it is that they read. And the best description of this that I've ever heard was also by my son Daniel, who said when he was 11 years old, he said, "Mom, you know that voice that is talking in your head when you're reading, and you can hear the words as you go along, your eyes go along the page?" And I said, "Yeah, I know that voice." And he said, "Well, sometimes I get to the end of the page and I realize the voice was talking, but I wasn't listening." So that happens. How many people have had that happen? You get to the bottom of the page, you realize the voice was talking, but you weren't listening. You were thinking about whether you should move to Malta. You were thinking about whether you should buy a cat. You were thinking about something entirely different. Your eyes were reading the words, so it wasn't dyslexia, but it was a reading attentional disorder. It was not being able to pay attention to what it is you're doing. Highlighting helps with that a lot, because not because you're going to come back and study something later on. That's not the real reason that you highlight. You highlight because as you are reading something that you are having to highlight, you're asking yourself the question, is this an important sentence? If you have to ask yourself the question, is this an important sentence, you're having to process, right? You're having to process the sentence every single time. And if it is an important sentence, what are you going to do? You're going to go over it with the highlighter, so you're actually going to read it again. So you've actually processed it twice instead of processing it 0 times. And then maybe later on you can come back and process it a 3rd time, but the point is that you've actually done it twice. This would be, we talked about before, this would be a silly report card. Rodney is still having difficulty seeing as well as would be expected for his age. We want him to see better. But we don't have any problem saying this. Rodney is still having difficulty paying attention as well as would be expected for his age. We want him to concentrate better. He needs to put more effort into remaining on task in all areas of the curriculum. This semester he's been more disorganized than most children his age, and we hope he will work on this in the future. Great. Those are all the things. If a kid has a diagnosed attentional problem, those are all the things that are his actual disabilities. It's just like telling a blind kid to see better or telling a deaf kid that he needs to hear better. It doesn't work. You need to find other ways. And if I were that parent getting that report card, I would be asking the teacher, okay, how are you going to do that? How are you going to teach him to do those things? What strategies are you going to put in place or teach him to put in place to make those things happen? Because just telling him that doesn't make it happen. Medication works usually, at least in the short term. There are various medications that cause the executive functioning to work better. And in high school, that can be very, very important because you have a lot of things to remember. You have a lot of things that you're supposed to be doing at the same time. So medication can make a big difference in functioning. In fact, to the point, my son didn't start medication until he was 15. And again, he was at boarding school and he called me up. He said, I think it's time for me to start medication. I said, okay. You have to go see Ned Hollowell, who's another sort of guru of ADHD and was working near where his school was. And So he went off and got the medication. He called me up a week later and he said, "Do you mean to tell me the rest of the world's been living like this for 15 years and I didn't know it?" And it actually, not only could he, the big thing for him was he could remember to call his girlfriend. You know, his grades went up, but you don't put kids on medication to improve their grades, or at least I wouldn't. That was a side effect. What happened most of all was that his mood went up. He became much happier with himself, realized that he was very competent at doing things, started 2 clubs that were very important clubs for the school, and he'd been thinking about them for 3 years but didn't actually organize himself to get it. So it actually can make a huge difference. I would be saying different things if we were talking about really younger kids. I'm not a big pusher of medication, but it does work, and in high school it can be important. One of the things that's very important is that it be adjusted. So the person who is prescribing medication needs to change it. The first dosage is not going to be the right dosage because they're doing a little bit of guessing. If I am giving somebody aspirin or an antibiotic, I can say, well, how much do you weigh? And you know, I'll give you that amount of aspirin or that amount of antibiotic. But any type of brain medication is idiosyncratic. Some brains react a lot and some brains react a little. So you could have a little kid who, you know, takes a lot of medication and doesn't make a dent, and you could have a great big football player who takes just a little bit of medication and falls asleep. You know, so you really have to adjust it. And what most doctors will do is they'll start out at a very, very baby dose. They'll start out very little, and then they'll increase it. But that means that the parents have to go back to get the right amount, and they have to know from the teachers whether or not it's working. Because what happens lots of times is that these are time-release things. They work for a certain amount of the day. The kid takes it at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning or 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, goes to school, and it's worked all day, but by the time he gets home from school, it's either worn off or it's gone below baseline. And so what the parents see is that it's either making no difference or it's even worse than before. And so what they need to hear from you is, no, actually at school we're seeing a huge change. And they need to get you guys are very, very important in giving that feedback to them. And a lot of parents are terrified of medication. They're scared of taking medication or having their kids take medication. There are good reasons for that. I'm not a big medication pusher, but in some cases you have to look at the side effects of not taking medication. If the child's self-esteem is going down, if the child is more likely to become an addict, if they're not having friends, if their relationships are failing, if they're failing in school, if they're getting in trouble all the time, so their self-concept is now really low and they're thinking of themselves as a bad kid or a thug, then those are bad side effects. Like I said before, those are the things that 10 years from now, later, or 20 years later, they're going to be coming in to see a psychologist about those issues, not about the ADHD. So evaluate the side effects of not taking medication. And before you try medication, there are a lot of things you can try within the environment. So try adjusting the environment first. We're going to talk very quickly about 3 other things. The first one is autism spectrum disorders, which is a ballooning, huge, exploding group of kids. It used to be that autism was very, very rare, and it's becoming more and more common, not just because of change in definition. It is becoming more common. Kids with various layers of difficulty are becoming more common. And so every school is likely to have some kids with ASD. These kids tend to be isolated socially. They tend to be a little weird, a little odd, do things a little differently, dress differently maybe, or have quirky ways of behaving, which in various schools can mean that they might get in trouble. Lots of times they don't understand social interchanges. So they can see that other people understand them. And Temple Grandin, who is a great example of somebody who has autism and now has a PhD in animal behavior, and she's one of the wealthiest people in the US because she has designed all of the animal slaughterhouses actually in the US. she calls herself an anthropologist from Mars. She talks about how she sort of has to look at an interaction as an anthropologist would and analyze it very objectively, because she doesn't subjectively automatically understand it. And so they might not understand language differences or social cues, things that, if I'm going like this, that probably means don't talk to me. But somebody with ASD would not necessarily recognize that. They can go on and on and on and on talking to somebody about, even though the other person is going and giving lots of body cues or social cues. They may not understand, they may be obsessed with a particular subject, may be obsessed with a particular interest. With younger kids, dinosaurs, trains. I knew a 5-year-old one time who knew every single train and MTR and bus stop in Hong Kong. And you could say, I am at Concordia International School, I want to get to Kennedy Town, how should I go? And he would tell you which bus would take you to where you would catch it, and where to catch the MTR to get back to, and he was 5. But he was just very, very brilliant kid who was fascinated with transportation, and you find that all the time. I think that I didn't put down here. So that's a very high IQ kid who has an area of expertise. Lots of times they don't get verbal interchanges that include idiomatic expressions or metaphors. So when you say, take a seat, they'll take a seat. Or if you say, that's really over the top, or I've got my eyes on you, and anything that is an idiomatic expression, they have a hard time interpreting what that really means. So when you say it's raining cats and dogs, they get very upset because it's not raining cats and dogs. Now Seinfeld the other day just kind of came out as having ASD. He thinks that he had ASD. Isn't that interesting? Jerry Seinfeld. And he talks about how he would get very upset when people used idiomatic expressions because they would annoy him because they weren't true. People with ASD have a very black and white approach lots of times to things. So things are either right or they're not right. They're either just or they're not just. They're good or they're bad. And so they can become very upset if things are not the way they are supposed to be. In one experiment, there was an experiment done about lying, for example. And they had a whole group of kids who were neurotypical kids, didn't have ASD, and they asked them, to rank lies, which is the worst lie, which is the best lie, which is kind of in the middle for lying. So obviously saying, no, that dress looks great on you, that's a good lie. No, I didn't punch the kid next to me in the nose, that's a bad lie. No, I didn't steal that scarf from the store, that's a really bad lie. So the kids who didn't have ASD had a great time with that. They were laughing and thinking it was terrific fun to try to decide which were the worst lies, right? Or which were the best lies. The kids with ASD broke down crying because that didn't make any sense. It's a lie. Lies are bad. You don't tell lies. There's no good lie. So it was a very distressful, very hard, difficult task for the kids with ASD. Kids with no problems didn't have any problem with that at all. So they often have a sense of perfectionism. Lots of times you'll see kids in school, in class, who get very upset when things are not just exactly right or when they have messed something up a little bit. They like to have routine. I had a kid one time who was about 11 or 12 years old who would cry at 12:01 if you were supposed to be out at 12. He was terrified when it got to be 12:01. His anxiety shot up because you're supposed to leave at 12. And it's now 12:01. That's wrong. That's not right. Anybody watch Parenthood? There's a really good character on Parenthood, a little boy who's actually now growing up, and whoever the actor is amazing. Because he does a very good job of portraying a kid with ASD, and the kid is very aware of time. And lots of times kids with ASD have poor eye contact. Not everybody who has poor eye contact has ASD. So it might be that a person is shy, or it might be that a person just never learned to have eye contact. Certainly there are some cultures in which it's not, it's rude to look people in the eyes. So don't just assume that everybody that's not looking at you has ASD, and I'm getting a lot of referrals when that's the case. They gotta have a lot of these other things as well. But quite often people with ASD are not looking at you. They're talking to you, but they're looking somewhere else. Lots of times they have high levels of anxiety. They get very upset when things are not perfect or not right. They can be obsessive about certain things. They tend to lack a personal psychology. One of the things we all develop as individuals, as people, is that we try to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. We try to understand how you would feel or how you would be thinking about a particular problem. If you knew this, and I knew this, this, and this, what would you think the answer would be, as opposed to what I would think the answer would be? And most of us are pretty good at trying to figure that out, trying to suss that out and say, you know, I think that he probably would not understand this because he didn't have these two bits of information and I did. But people with ASD don't develop that personal psychology, and lots of times they lack empathy, not because they're mean people, but because they haven't thought about what somebody else would be feeling or thinking in a particular situation. Lots of times they get bullied at school, so if you have a child with ASD, you need to be watching for that and making sure that he's not bullied. Sometimes it helps to talk to the other kids about, you know, this kid is not very good at social stuff. He's really smart at math. He's really good at some other things, but his social stuff is not his big strength. And point out that there are an awful lot of people in the world who are great, you know, great CEOs, great people. Einstein is one of them, who may have been a little quirky socially, but made a difference. And they can be very sensitive to light or to noise. A lot of kids with autism would be annoyed by the fact that you can hear that projector. So they might not be able to concentrate on what I'm saying because I can hear the projector. So they can get very, very, and little kids, they can be hyperlexic. Little children with ASD sometimes can read Shakespeare. They can read extremely well. So lots of times you have kids who read extremely well. And they might have special gifts. So write down rules, write down routines, make things clear, use concrete language, avoid sarcasm or analogy or metaphor or intonation. I had a woman who was helping with an outdoor program one time, and there was a boy with ASD, and he came and sat down beside where I was sitting with my colleague, and I said, you know, why don't you go out and play with the other kids? And he said, well, I don't really need to go out and play with the other kids because I have excellent social skills, thank you. And then he passed gas very, very loudly, just, and the person next to me, my colleague, she turned to him and she said, oh, I can tell. And he said, thank you, because he didn't realize that she was being sarcastic. So in that situation, you have to say, you know what? Don't pass gas when you're sitting next to me. You have to be very, very concrete about what you say. Talk about their special interests. Temple Grandin talks about one particular teacher who changed her life. That year, Temple Grandin had autism, severe autism, not Asperger's. And that year she was particularly interested in sliding doors, so doors going in and out. And this teacher made everything about sliding doors. So she taught geography by talking about where the glass for sliding doors would come from. She taught math by measuring sliding doors. They read about doors. The teacher changed everything into something having to do with sliding doors. And so Temple Grandin started to engage with that teacher a whole lot. And teach social skills explicitly. Say exactly what you mean. Don't use sarcasm, and watch for bullying. Just a quick review of some of the people who had ADHD or ASD. If you eliminate all those people, you're eliminating a lot of the great changes that we've made in the world. Jerry Seinfeld I added in this morning because just literally 2 days ago he came out on TV and said that he thought he had ASD. So we're going to go very quickly through dyslexia. There's no magic to dyslexia. Dyslexia is simply an inability to read given enough background. So if you have been out in the jungle until you're 15 and suddenly you're being asked to read, then you don't have dyslexia. You have being out in the jungle. If you just have been speaking English for 1 year and you have been in local Chinese school until you're 12 and now you're 13 and you don't read in English, that's not dyslexia. That's English as a second language. So dyslexia is really just the inability to, an unusual inability to learn to read. Remember, reading is a fairly new skill for mankind. It's something we've only been doing for the last 100 years or so in mass. There were some people who could read years ago, but for the most part, if you didn't read 100 years ago, it was no big deal, and you could still be a leader in your community, and you could still be, make a lot of money. But reading has become, over the last 100 years, something that everybody has to do. If you were a great knight and could read, nobody cared. But if you could read and were not a great knight, who was going to be the more successful of the two? Well, probably the great knight. He had a sword. Demands a lot of phonemic awareness in English, at least. People who have problems with reading in English, lots of times they don't see the bricks of the building. They don't see the pieces of the words. They don't hear them. They can't distinguish them when they're little, and even when they're big sometimes. There are differences in the way the brain works. So functional magnetic resonance imaging has shown that people who are dyslexic tend to process reading in a different way than people who are not dyslexic. So they're not just, again, they're not just being willful or bad or not trying, or they're not being lazy. They really do have brains that function a little bit differently. Now, the thing that's interesting about Shaywitz is that she was studying students at Yale. So they were smart students. They were good students. You don't get to Yale if you're not a smart student. But she still was seeing differences in the way they processed stuff. So don't confuse it. Difficulty sounding out words, might learn lots of sight words, but still not be able to sound out words. And as they grow up, those students at Yale or other people as adults, they may be able to read, but it's very slow, it's very labored, it's very difficult, takes them a long time. And lots of times they might have subtle language disorders, look for problems with rhyming when they're little, problems with memorization, problems learning a foreign language. It might be difficult for kids with dyslexia. Learning letters and sounds might be difficult. Spelling is a problem. And word reversals, remember saying to instead of at, or saying, well, I have a very good friend who, very, very good friend who's visited my house in Washington, D.C., knew me for 20 years and knew my father for 10 years. My father's name is Sanford. And she met my father many times. And all the way up until 5 years after he died, I was afraid to kind of tell her that his name was not Stanford. It was Sanford. And she just could not get that. She got it wrong every single time. And that's because that was a dyslexic issue. Dysgraphia, no handwriting. Here's the thing to do about no handwriting. People who have dysgraphia, it's because they're having difficulty with that neuromotor coordination. If you want to see what it feels like, try writing with your non-dominant hand. Try going to a conference and taking notes in your non-dominant hand. It's virtually impossible. Try answering a test with your non-dominant hand. It's very, very difficult. So what happens, remember we were talking about working memory, what happens is if you're trying to write with your non-dominant hand, or if you have dysgraphia, a lot of your working memory, a lot of your attention is going to that hand, going to that writing process, and so you can't think very well. You really can't listen very well. You can't pay attention very well. You can't do math very well because you're trying to make your hand go. So it's not that you don't understand the math, it's that you can't handwrite and do math at the same time. It's kind of like doing this. It's a little difficult if you have dysgraphia. So little kids will avoid or refuse handwriting. Big kids look like they're being oppositional or trying to refuse the handwriting. They may have messy handwriting, poor spelling, irregular spaces, sometimes difficulty with pencil grip, so they're holding things wrong. Lots of times they can answer questions verbally, but they just can't pass the test. And it's because the test is handwritten. So any ideas about what to do about not being able to handwrite? Don't handwrite.
Can we train?
Well, you can if he's 5. If he's 5 or he's 6 years old, yeah. Spend lots of times at occupational therapy, get lots of good handwriting. If he's 12, give him a computer. If he's not able to do the typing is much, much easier than handwriting because it's really only up and down. Handwriting is very, very difficult because you have to have a particular grip on the pencil, then you have to align the paper correctly, then you have to have the pressure on the pencil at the right level, and then you have to remember, your fingers have to remember some very, very complex dances to write something. But if you are typing something, you're really going up and down and this way, much easier. So a lot of times the entire solution is just simply use a computer. That isn't the solution for math. We'll get to that in a second, but it is the solution to writing a story or writing an essay or even answering a test. If that's not possible, if for some reason the kid has broken hands, then speech-to-text technology helps a lot. You now just talk into the computer and the computer will type it and then the kid just has to correct it. It's really, we've gotten to a point where dysgraphia should never, ever, ever be an issue because it's just a dumb thing to have to not be able to do. It's not necessary. It's like being able to read a sundial. 20 years from now, nobody is going to be handwriting. And stopping everything else in the service of handwriting is not reasonable. Doesn't make sense.
Is there any case that the kid will have a problem typing with the keyboard?
Sometimes. Not very often.
If they cannot write, then for the same reason.
No.
The kid
Most of the
type.
time, people who have dysgraphia can type very well. And actually, you see these transformations when kids are like in 3rd or 4th grade and they're suddenly given a computer, and kids have been resistant to writing before are producing stories that are like 3 pages long. So yeah, typing is usually much easier for the reasons I just said. There's a lot of complexity to handwriting and not as much complexity to memorizing where your hand goes for typing. But yes, sometimes you do have kids who can't do that either. And if they can't do that either, then speech-to-text technology solves that problem. The one thing that does not solve is math. And math involves handwriting and thinking at the same time. And especially as you're learning new things, if you're having problems with handwriting, people with dysgraphia should have somebody else handwrite for them while they're trying to think through the problem. So if they're trying to do an algebra problem, for example, and they have to be thinking about what's going to happen, you know, what needs to get done, don't ask them to do that in handwriting at the same time. Let them do it while somebody else is doing the writing. So they'll say, okay, subtract 4 from both sides, now divide by 3, you know, so the person is doing the handwriting for them. And then after they get used to it and it's automatic and they know the algorithm, they don't have to think as much, then they can do the handwriting, usually, unless they've got severe dysgraphia. So speeded math tests, we don't probably have those here, but lots of times in grammar school, primary school, you see minute math, you see 1-minute math tests, and kids are supposed to finish in 1 minute. And the idea is that if they don't know the math, they can't finish in 1 minute. But the fact is, even if they do know the math, if they can't handwrite, they can't finish in 1 minute. So lots of times kids are failed for not knowing their math, when in fact they know their math very well. If you show them a flashcard, they can tell you the answer like that. They just can't handwrite it. And this can be real disastrous. My nephew came in, was supposed to do minute math in 1st grade, and you didn't get the next sheet until you finished the 1st sheet. 3 years later, he was still coming in every single day and sitting down and getting the same sheet of paper. So every day he knew that he had to face failure first thing in the morning. And that was because he couldn't handwrite. It was not because he didn't know the math. He knew the math by heart. Of course, he knew much more advanced math by that time. So what to do? Find another avenue of production, keyboard, get occupational therapy for handwriting if it's a young child. If the kid is already 10, 11, 12 years old, then first of all, the occupational therapy is not going to be that effective. But second of all, he's got a lot of other things to do in life. And probably handwriting is never going to be his biggest skill. So, you know, maybe he should be getting a lot of other types of things or having, you know, doing other tutoring or other things to do. And OT is really not that important. And take handwriting away from schoolwork and assessments in non-handwriting subjects. If it's a younger child, teach handwriting separately. So it's not that you don't teach handwriting. Do teach handwriting, but just don't make it a part of storytelling, for example. Let a child write a story and you have an adult scribe for him, and then maybe the child copies over a little bit, a few lines of that story. So he's still getting handwriting as a young child, but it's not stopping everything else, you know? You don't want to stop all other production until they learn handwriting, because frankly, handwriting is just not that important. And if you eliminate folks with dyslexia or dysgraphia, you eliminate all of these people who, you know, clearly we don't want to eliminate.
We were just debating Tom Cruise.
Yeah, Tom Cruise. Well,
Give or take.
okay, I have a whole long thing about testing and assessment, but let me just go back a little bit. Hold on. But we're not going to talk about a lot of those things. Previous. No, never mind. The whole point of assessment should be to find the strengths, not just the weaknesses. If a child can't read and you send him to me and the parents pay $20,000 and I say, this child can't read, you've just wasted a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money. Because you already knew the child couldn't read, right? That's why you sent him to me. I should be able to give you a whole lot more information than this child can't read. I should be able to say this child can't read, but he's got great visual memory, so it's not a matter of not being able to see stuff. And he's very creative, and he's really, really good at math. So those are his strengths, and he's a really good friend, and he's got good EQ, he's got good emotional health. And he has problem with hearing sounds. So I should be able to get much better at being able to tell you what the problems are, but also whatever the strengths are. And it should be a fun activity for the child. You have to remember that testing should not be about only one way of evaluating a person. And this is sort of based on Einstein's statement that, you know, if you tell a fish that he's going to be judged by his ability to climb a tree, then he's going to spend his whole life feeling like he's stupid. Everybody's good at something, or most people are good at something. And part of the job of an assessment is to try to find out what that something is, so that we can give that to the child as something that they can carry forward, especially in high school, because then they have to go to college or whatever it is they're going to do. So you should get a lot of different things, and I'll just give you my pages here. But it should be a comprehensive assessment, and it should end up with recommendations for home and recommendations for school. And it should include a debrief with the child so that the child actually understands what's going on. And we always tell the family that the school can be invited to, so teachers can be invited too. You have to remember that tests are really fallible. They are not physics. This is not something that can be measured like with a ruler. Kids are taking strange tests in strange places with strange people at a strange time, so they're doing things they've never heard of before. Sometimes they're in a bad mood. I had one kid, again, given your age group, you'll appreciate this. I had one kid who really looked tired on the day of the testing. As I was about halfway through, I said, you know, you really look tired. Did you get enough sleep last night? He said, no, I'm just really hungover. So, so his test results obviously were not going to reflect his best thinking. So kids have off days, they have off moments. If you get a report that doesn't seem to match the child you're seeing, the child's still the child. The report is wrong. And people oftentimes just think that the report must be right because it's got numbers. And just because it has numbers, that doesn't make it right. Sometimes the reports can be absolute nonsense. Sometimes the tests are misnamed. I just talked about that this morning with somebody about a test called long-term retrieval. It's called long-term retrieval, but that's really not what it measures. So use your common sense. Use the label to inform, not to exclude a child. Look at how bad something is, not what the symptom is. So if I say somebody has mild dysgraphia, or mild ADHD, that might mean that they might have occasional problems in the classroom, or maybe I need to give them a computer, or maybe I need to, But if I say somebody has severe ADHD, that kid might be really disruptive in the classroom and maybe even a danger to what's going on in the area. So just the word ADHD doesn't give you an idea of what type of kid it is. Or dysgraphia, mild dysgraphia might mean you might want to give him a little extra time for taking a test where he has to handwrite. Severe dysgraphia means he needs speech-to-text technology and he really can't handwrite. So you have to look at the severity of whatever it is you're talking about, not the symptomology. Use strategies. Expect differences among kids, because kids are different, just like adults are different. And they have different gifts and weaknesses, and both of those should be assessed, not just one. And when you have an assessment done, use the parts that make sense to you and whatever is helpful, and then just don't pay attention to the rest of it, because it's not written in gold. And with you all, you don't have a learning support department, right? So I wanted to be sure and let you know that you should feel free to call us. Don't call me, call her. Call her or email me. I'm just impossible to get on the phone. You can email me or you can call her, and we have the advantage of having a team. So if you call me and you ask me a question about autism, chances are I'm not going to answer you directly unless it's, pretty common knowledge. But I have Amanda Oswald. Dr. Oswald specializes in kids with ASD, and I also have Dr. Greenberg. Christy Cragen can tell you a lot of things about testing. I might be maybe the person Christy would ask a question about ADHD. So it's great. And we have a speech therapist that we constantly ask questions to because she's got an area of expertise that none of us knows anything about. So we've got a whole team of people who can help inform. So if you're having a particular problem with a particular kid in a particular class, we're happy to help within reason, because that child is going through a bad time. And it's part of our mission to be helping that kid not go through a bad time. It's very important to us that that child be sort of saved from that situation, and that the most effective strategies be used for dealing with them. So do feel free to call us or email us, within reason, and use us as your sort of SEN team if you want. At the beginning I said, who's Rodney? Or this is a presentation for Rodney. Nobody ever asked who's Rodney, so I'll tell you anyway. Rodney was a kid who was 4 years old when I was first a teacher, so he is now 40-ish, at least. And Rodney just never would get stuff done, and he was disorganized, and he would poke his neighbor, and I would, because I was a new teacher, I would make him stay in. I knew he was really smart, and I would make him stay in during recess to finish his work. And of course, now I realize that, first of all, Rodney really needed that recess. That was, it was more important for him than for anybody in the school, and that he probably had ADHD. And everything I was doing, with all the best intention in my heart, I would be sitting there with tears rolling down my cheeks, and Rodney would be sitting there with tears rolling down his cheeks. And we would both be really upset that he couldn't get this homework done or this schoolwork done. And I thought he was being resistant, and I had to help him through this hump. And he probably thought I was crazy, who knows. But from then on, as soon as I realized what I was doing wrong as a young teacher, I've dedicated every presentation about ADHD to Rodney. So, any questions? I know we kind of ran over time.
So we should the case that the kid, the ADHD, the kid will help the kid to realize, to be aware of the problem and how to solve the problem by himself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, so the symptom will not become better by itself, right?
No. Well, no. They need to know strategies for dealing with the symptoms. So different ways of getting stuff done. And yes, that child may grow up to be somebody who forgets his keys, or somebody who tends to show up late for lunch, or needs a reminder to bring his cards with him to a talk like this. But the hyperactive part goes away in a lot of cases. About 2/3 of cases, the hyperactivity goes down, but the inattention or the disorganization, lots of times that's going to continue through.
Do you recommend medication throughout their lives? Or how-
As I said, that's very, oh, you mean
For medication.
if they start medication when they're adolescents?
Or younger.
The problem with medication is that, first of all, it's very dependent on the situation and on the kid. So I don't necessarily recommend medication at all. It might be that you can change a lot of other things. And as I said, change the environment first. But if a person is taking medication and if it is helping, then it's like glasses. It's not curing anything unless it's on. So if you stop taking medication, you go back to, or if you stop using your glasses, you go, but you can't see, right? And if you stop taking medication, then your brain chemistry goes back, and you do revert back to the same functioning that you had before, with two provisos. The first is that, or exceptions rather. The first is that the medication itself helps you to realize that you can do these things. So with lots of people, they will take the medication and then they'll stop taking the medication, but they've already had the experience of using the strategies, and they've learned the strategies while they were on medication, and they've got the experience of success, and so they have more energy for making themselves do things. But they're still reverting back to the same degree of inattention. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that adults quite often choose, if they're choosing wisely, they choose jobs that are ADHD friendly. So CEO, stockbroker, investment banking. If you go to, the investment banking community, I swear 99%, no. You're going to find a lot of people with ADHD in that high risk, very active, very exciting community. Anything that is project-based, architects lots of times, engineers, things that have, again, a beginning and an end. Those types of teachers, a lot of teachers have ADHD because it's a job where you can stand up, you can walk around, you can direct the activity. So it's a lot better than sitting and just sitting at a desk from 9 to 5. And unfortunately, we expect kids to be generalists. We expect them to sit in desks when we want them to sit in desks. The classroom is absolutely ADHD unfriendly, unless you're the teacher. If you're the teacher, it's actually very ADHD friendly. So there are different professions that are good for people with ADHD. My job is great for somebody with ADHD. I see somebody for 1 hour, then they go away, and somebody else comes, and I see them for an hour, and they go away. It's all project-based, there's little pieces of time. So those types of jobs, if you have those types of jobs, you have less of a need for medication. If you're an accountant and you're sitting down all day adding up numbers and a lot of things that are boring or repetitive, then you might need to take medication. Again, I have a lot of attentional problems, and the only job I've ever been fired from is as a secretary. Not a good job for somebody with ADHD. But the job I've got right now is great for it. So when people grow up, it depends a lot on the situation. The person that I know who is a musician, she does not take medication when she is playing in concert, but she does take medication in the morning because she has to deal with all the details of taking care of her son getting the groceries and doing all the management things that she does during the day, even practicing sometimes. But for concerts, she doesn't take it.
So we have several students. I believe they are. We always describe them as slow worker, but they do not create any problem. They have no problem at all with the
Okay.
So these are also ADHD.
Maybe. I mean, we don't know why
So
they're slow workers.
academically, they are always very poor.
Okay.
And as you said, many of them are girls. Yeah.
So it would be good, I mean, you really can't say whether they have ADHD or not unless, without sort of a more comprehensive assessment, because what you want to be looking at is a lot of the other things that could be creating that situation. ADHD is really sort of a rule-out diagnosis. You have to rule out everything else out, and what's left is ADHD. So it could be that they have dyslexia. It could be that they have dysgraphia. It could be that they have depression or anxiety, or processing speed problems, or language, processing problems. So we have to find out that they don't have all those things before we say it's probably ADHD.
So IEPs must be quite crucial in that guiding the learning strategies and making sure they were effective. Is that
And having goals and making sure that they have strategies. I think it's also a matter of making sure that the teachers and the parents are on the same page and they know what it is that you're trying to create and have happen, and that the kids also understand that, and that it be, again, strength-based.
What's the effect of leniency on the rest of the class? Showing your leniency on these ADHD students, all the special strategies. What's
Yeah.
the effect on the rest of the class?
Most of the ADHD strategies, or the strategies that are good for kids with ADHD, are good for all kids. So when you have that bulletin board up there, that's something that every kid is going to benefit from. It's just that the ADHD kid is going to be the one that has 2 notes up there all the time. You don't want leniency. You want strategies. You don't want to ignore behavior that's bad. You want to interrupt behavior that's bad. You don't want to be, the worst thing you can do is extend a deadline for a kid with ADHD. Don't extend a deadline for a kid with ADHD, because you're just teaching them that you can always extend deadlines. And kids with ADHD need to know that that's not possible. They need to stay up all night if they have to, because they will procrastinate as long as they can, because it's hard for them to activate. So you don't want, it's not leniency, it's understanding and strategy building, rather than making special exceptions. If you do have somebody who does need an extra special exception, like I would think somebody with ASD, for example, would be more likely to need an exception because he was rude, or because he didn't understand the social context, or he did something eccentric or weird, or because he was emotional. And you can explain to other kids, you know what, he has a real problem controlling his emotions sometimes, and that's okay. That's one of his weaknesses, and we're just going to let him calm down outside. And kids are usually pretty good at understanding that if they see that understanding coming from the top. But no, you don't. I hope I didn't sound like I think you should be lenient with either the blind kid or the kid with ADHD. You don't want to ignore the blind kid so that he bangs into the wall. And you don't want to ignore the ADHD kid so that he fails school. That's not a good solution. You want to be able to teach him strategies.
Do you reckon the schools, in your experience, you reckon schools are properly resourced to help these kids? Or is there anything schools can do to be properly resourced?
I think just what you're doing right now, lots of education, lots of figuring out, what those different things are. And certainly, I don't know, how many kids do you have at this school?
All together 95.
95. So yeah, you're still small school.
Small school,
Not
yeah,
bad.
but we about 10%, I would say, around 10% of our students, I would say, this quarter.
Mm-hmm.
this kind of thing.
Fall into that,
Very
yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. I have,
We only admit those students who do not have discipline problem.
mhm,
Therefore, that means that we only have ADHD with mild ADHD syndrome.
right,
which is
exactly.
the one way.
And so those are the kids that, and then, so a lot of how they should be sourced depends on, or resource is dependent on how many kids are there who have these sorts of issues and how, you know, how severe those issues might be. And as schools are growing, it becomes, you know, very difficult to know.
Is there any advantage to telling teachers of kids being ADHD? Should they know that particular student is ADHD?
Again, it depends on the teachers, the background, and the education, and sort of the feeling of the school and what the kid knows. So there are a lot of factors that can go into that. When my son applied to university, he said, should I put down that I have ADHD? And I said, if you're applying to Harvard, yes. You know, if you're applying to Harvard, put down that you have ADHD. They're going to understand it the same way that you understand it and that I understand it. A lot of their professors have ADHD. They know that this is, you know, that's a good thing for them to know about. But if you're applying to University of Edinburgh, which he was, no, don't say that, because they're going to have a different understanding. Labels should help, not hurt. They should be a roadmap for helping you to know how you can deal with this particular kid or give you some ideas, not a reason to exclude the kid from the activity or from the, you know, from the school. So lots of times it's helpful to tell the teacher, because the teacher can, it's a shortcut. You know, the teacher can say, oh, okay, ADHD. I learned lots of different strategies for dealing with ADHD. Here's how I can address those. And so it helps them not to become as frustrated with that child, because now they've got an idea of what they can do with them. But lots of times when we're doing assessments, I will change the diagnosis to just say attentional problems, because you know what? It means the same thing. And for some schools, that might be a more helpful way. And then I'll say, well, you know, children who have attentional problems can benefit from sitting at the front of the class. Before that, it said children with ADHD can benefit from sitting at the front of the class. It means the same thing. So a lot depends on the school. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. That was
for this talk.
fun.
So your talk give us you know, help us a lot, and then, you know, better understanding of
Well,
this
good.
area. Yeah. So direct us how to
I'll just pull it out, yeah.
teach better. You know. Can I have a version of your PowerPoint?
Sure, I was just
Yeah.
going to say I can send you some of
Send
the
it
some of the
to my
pages.
email.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, I have Dr. Craig's business